right, great. Well, everybody, thank you so much for coming tonight. It is really a pleasure to have you here and to be in Danbury to talk about Dietrich. And also thank you everybody online who is joining us remotely. It's great to have you here too. The drawings, just so that everybody knows, are on display in the background. They're original drawings by the architect. So please feel free after we're done to take a look. And I'll be kind of standing over there afterwards as well if you have any more questions about the drawings or for me following up from our discussion here in the presentation. So I just wanted to start out by giving you a little bit of a summary where we're going, so it doesn't seem, it's kind of hard if you have a roadmap. So we're going to talk about architect E.G.W. Dietrich tonight. We're going to talk about his different architectural styles that he worked in over time. E. Starr Sanford, who was, of course, the first owner and the builder of the Hearthstone Castle, and then the Hearthstone itself. So just a little bit about me to start with, just so you know. As Catherine mentioned, I've been researching Dietrich now for over 10 years, and in that time, I've documented about 450 of his designs. I've been visiting around the country to 5 different states so far to see his built works and take photos and sort of understand them better. My research process all started when I was writing the National Register nomination for the John Mollenhauer House in Bayshore, Long Island. And you can see the house pictured here. So just to give you a little bit of background about Dietrich, he was born on February 22nd, 1857. And of course, that's President's Day, that's George Washington's birthday. And so that is, of course, where his middle name, Ernest George Washington Dietrich, comes from. Just so that you know, his first name comes from his uncle. He was named after his father's brother. So he was basically the oldest of his siblings. There were 6 of them, and his parents were Jacob and Johanna Dietrich. And they were both immigrants that came to the US from Germany. So he was really the first one born here in the country. Jacob had served during he served during the Civil War. And unfortunately, during that time, he was injured and actually spent some time in a hospital down in Alexandria. And I think that he really came back with a lot of demons from that event. He turned to drinking and had some issues after that. And actually, Johanna, for that time, it was very uncommon, but she filed for divorce. And so Dietrich from a young age was actually sort of the only, he was the oldest of the children. He was a male. So he was really kind of responsible for the family when he was a young person. She went on in Pittsburgh, where he was born and where they lived, to have several different boarding houses and rooming houses. And that's how she supported the family at that time. And you can see here, if you look at this census, you see him listed in 1880, living with his family, and he's listed already as an architect at that time period. So this is one of the first drawings that we have by Dietrich. It was done in 1879, and it's currently held by the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. It wasn't an original design by his. This drawing was actually a copy from the architect that you see here at the bottom. It was H. Hudson Holly. It was actually designed to be built in Stamford, and the house was located there. But I think basically in 1879, when he was training, he would look in the architectural periodicals, and he used those for inspiration and then replicated the drawings to kind of practice his technique and his drawing process. He went to Duff's College in Pittsburgh, which was a general kind of business school, but they also had drafting and architecture programs. And then he also attended the Western College of Pennsylvania. After that, he went on to do an internship with the firm of Drum and Kuhn. And then going on to his actual practice, what's interesting is in 1881, he left Pittsburgh and came to Brooklyn. And he lived in Brooklyn for a short period of time, and he published some different designs in architectural periodicals at that time. But I don't know if he was working for another architect or if he was just trying to basically get commissions through publishing his designs in the magazines. But whatever it was, it didn't last long or go well. And so he went back to Pittsburgh again by September. And when he went back, he was working for James Steen. And this is an interesting drawing here. You can see it's the basically the YMCA building in downtown Pittsburgh. And it's credited to Steen, it's his design, but if you look closely, and I blew it up here in the picture for you, you can see his initials down in the bottom. And this was a very common thing for Dietrich through the years because he was mostly executing all of his own drawings and watercolors and things himself for the presentation drawings. You'll look around and search and always see his signature hiding down in the corner. So after his time with Steen, he teamed up basically with Charles Bartberger. And Bartberger was a son of another Bartberger, another Charles Bartberger, who was a very successful German architect who came to Pittsburgh. And so basically, Charles Bartberger brought the sort of architectural know-how of running an office from his father and the client list. And Dietrich, being young and having a lot of talent at that time, really brought the design and the drafting and the drawing skills. So the two of them teamed up and they really had a successful practice that just started to flourish right away. You can see a couple of examples, early ones of the ones here from Bartberger and Dietrich. And so here we have a little bit of personal information on the architect. So this is E.G.W. Dietrich here on the right and his wife, Eliza Estelle, on the left. They were married in Pittsburgh on November 12th, 1884. She was the daughter of a very well-known Lutheran minister, and he actually officiated at the ceremony. And at the time when they were in Pittsburgh, he was actually living in a suburb called Emsworth, which was just a little ways out on the river from the main center of town. So to talk a little bit about the styles tonight that we'll go over, of course, Dietrich's first work and what he was really known for and came into prominence for is the shingle style. Other than that, he also worked in the colonial revival style, and he was really an early proponent of that design when it came into being. He also is known for his work in the craftsman style, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and then of course, arts and crafts. So to begin with, the shingle style, just for you, those of you that don't have a big architectural background, is really something that's unique to North America. It's known for its asymmetrical forms and volumes. The natural materials that are used, wood, shingles, also, sometimes there's stucco that's incorporated in different stonework designs. Also grouping fenestration. So rather than having, Victorian sort of older houses with those big, tall, separated windows, they started to group the windows together and created more of a horizontal form rather than vertical. And then, of course, there was a big emphasis on this time period about connection with the outdoors. So there was a lot to do with porches and loggias and balconies and so on. So it was really about blurring the line between the indoors and the outdoors. And I just want to read for you a quote from him at that time. And I think this really relates thinking ahead to his design of the hearthstone. This was from Cobblestone Building, an essay. The design should not be one of those gingerbread-looking designs, but should be a bold treatment and outline, short of all unnecessary details, such as flimsy cornices and other unnecessary effects on the part of a designer to spoil a bold roof line or wall space. So what he's saying here really is that we don't want to put a lot of man-made, factory-produced frilly things, fretwork, all of those sorts of things. We want to take all of that ornamentation off and really strip the building down to its cleaner form and express, what's happening with the architecture rather than putting a bunch of stuff on top to hide the architecture. And so an early example of this, which I think is really quite dramatic, is the George Macbeth House, which was built in the Shadyside neighborhood in Pittsburgh. You can see a drawing here. This was Bartberger and Dietrich in 1884. And this is a picture of how the house looks today. You can see a little bit of the interior. That would have all been, of course, natural wood to begin with, not painted. There are these sort of circles and sunburst patterns that you'll see that he carries throughout in a lot of his designs. And the other interesting thing just to note is looking at the house, those are not wood shingles. They're actually, red slate shingles that are on it. So it's actually stone here. So I had seen it in drawings for a long time and thought that it was wood, and then you get there in person, it's this beautiful stone. So it's a really dramatic effect. So the next pair of houses to talk about are the Wisner houses located in Warwick, New York. Warwick was really important because it was sort of the first projects to bring Dietrich to the East Coast away from Pittsburgh and the sort of Western Pennsylvania area. And I'll just read a quote that was published in the newspaper at this time when the houses were completed. Situated on the western side of South Main Street stand two houses which attract the attention of all who pass along the street. So entirely unlike are they from what the eye is accustomed to see, and so pleasing to the lover of picturesque effect in color and outline that one never tires in studying them, always finding some new point of interest. So these houses really had an impact on his career at this time and brought a lot of attention. The first one is called Dulce Domum, which was the Louise Wisner house. You can see a drawing here. And this is how the house there looks today, located in Warwick. And then located right next door was the Clinton Wisner house. Clinton Wisner went on to become the mayor in Warwick. So he was quite an important person in town. He also had a lot of business connections in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And basically through the commission of these two houses, Clinton was able to connect Dietrich with many people in the area over on the East Coast. And he started to get more and more commissions over here, taking his attention away from Pennsylvania. And this is the way that house looks today. You can still see all of the shingles and arches that are there. And so overall in Warwick, this is just an interesting overview. You can see how many different buildings that he did within the village. Another important house that was designed by Bartberger and Dietrich was the Court Williams house in Cincinnati. This is a house that I recently have just been in touch with the new owners on, and so I'm really excited that I have some current photos so you can see what the house looks like today, and even more dramatically what the new owners have done with the interior. And what's really great with this when you look is you can see really his imaginative use of decoration on the interior. So I mentioned in the last house these sort of spirals and sunbursts that were used. And you can see here where the corbels on the sides of the door, he's sort of placed these. Everyone is unique in the house with these different patterns. And so it really is something that is just refreshing and invigorating and really inventive for this time period, not all what you'd be used to seeing. So with all of this happening, these projects on the East Coast, in 1886, Dietrich basically ended his partnership with Bartberger and decided to move his family from Pittsburgh to New York. And so basically he opened an office at 294 Broadway. This is generally that stretch of Broadway at that time period. So that's what the city would have been like at the time. Through the years that he was in New York, he was always the main design person. He did pair up with some other architects over time. I won't read the whole list, but you can sort of see them here. So these were not really formal partnerships the way we'd think of them today in practice, but more like some sort of association or affiliation where they would work on different projects for a little bit and see how things went. So again, talking about the shingle style, part of what gets interesting with this is as the houses get bigger and larger, they start to take on more interesting elements like turrets and towers, and different projecting parts like the porte cochere you see here on this drawing, or the Thomas Jones house, which was in Scranton. And this is really just one to see the pictures of, because it really was such a breathtaking house. It's still there today. And again, you can see the way that the natural plantings, the ivy that comes in, it was really about blending the natural environment together with the stone and the shingles and wood that were used to construct the house. And this is just a photo of how the house looks today. And I'm always, as an architect today, detailing and thinking of things, the way that the stone on here sort of just falls away and turns into the wood and the tower that's curving, I think is really something unique. And you see it in a drawing, and then you can't believe when you get there in person that it's really been built that way. So it's really shocking. Going back to Warwick again, this was another beautiful shingle style house. This was called the Normandy, that was built for Judge Sanford, and this was in 1888. And what's interesting with this one in particular is to see the base of stone and the rest of the house in wood and shingle. But when the house was actually executed, it was built all just out of wood. So I think what happened is what we would call today VE. This was value engineering, and they decided the stone was going to be a little too expensive. And so the house still really is quite successful, but with a wood, rather than stone at the base. One of the buildings in Warwick, though, that was done in stone was the Warwick Reformed Church. And this was 1889. You can see here two of the original drawings of the church, and then most dramatically going and seeing the way that the building looked when it was finished. And so again, looking forward to the Hearthstone, again, you can see this was one of his works that really started to begin the use of this kind of stone where you're just not cutting it and not fitting it in a clean way, but really picking up the stones naturally and composing the facade by just putting them all together. Another house to mention is the Robert Marvin House in Jamestown, New York. This is a little later now, 1896. And what you can see in the drawing here and in the photos is that there's beginning to be a little bit of, I guess, what we would call more of the colonial ornamentation that's coming in. You can see with sort of the circular windows with the spider web mullions that are located inside, the sort of half circle Palladian window at the top. And at the time period, they didn't quite differentiate the way we do today with these clean lines of shingle style and colonial revival. They kind of called all of these things colonial houses at the time. And it was really referring back to kind of this American idea. And so the hybridness and sort of the mixing of these styles together a little bit was very natural at the time. This is a picture of how the house looks today. It's currently operated as an organization, as a club for a women's society there. And so the interiors are really in amazing condition. It's a beautiful home and has been extremely well maintained. And I'll give a little plug that I will be doing a presentation there in October, coming up in the fall. So just keep your ears open for that, and I'll be sharing some more information in the future. And then we have another house that was in Bayshore. This was the William H. Ray house. And this is interesting because it really is bringing in a lot of the Dutch gambrel style into the shingle style. You can see the Dutch gambrel roofs. Here is how the house looks today. And again, it has some of those more colonial elements that you can see in the windows. One of my favorite characteristics in the sort of left-hand side, you can see sort of the mullion work that does just this little flip of the mullion there. And this is a characteristic that Dietrich carried through in many of his designs. So I mentioned a little bit about those colonial revival details. And of course, the colonial revival style was something that came into being in the 1890s, really from the Columbian Exposition that was done in Chicago, and even before that, from sort of the centennial celebrations in 1876 for the whole country. So there had been this more emphasis looking back to some of those styles from earlier periods. And it was really in this time that the more formal, more clean lines and the sort of symmetrical massing that existed became more and more popular. This was also something where you had these large porticos with tall columns. There was decorative fenestration, balustrades that went across, especially oftentimes at the roof line to bring more decoration and ornament up there, and dormer windows. So this is a house that's interesting in New Jersey. It's called Nutwood, and this is really kind of a transitional one because I think it really ties in both characteristics of the shingle on the colonial revival. So you can take a look at it here. Originally, there would have been much more of that balustrade work. If you saw in the sketch just in the slide before, you can see at the top of the roof, it has some of these decorations and so on. But it really is kind of bringing together the shingle style to some extent and then these colonial revival elements. And of course, for his own home, Dietrich actually chose the colonial revival style. This was Sandinona, which was built in Bensonhurst, which is now part of Brooklyn. And this was a beautiful home. Even though he did this sort of symmetrical massing that you see in the overall form of the house, it's really interesting if you look at the floor plans because there's nothing sort of symmetrical going on there. I mean, the rooms are sort of jutting out, the porches are pushing in. So he took a lot of those shingle style plans that he had been working on, and the beauty of life in the shingle style with the openness to the porches, and then wrapped it up in the colonial revival exterior that was put on top. And here's a view of that house in the interior as well, the entry hall and staircase. And then going back to Warwick again, one of the most impressive, I guess, of his homes of this time period was the Johnson estate called the Knolls. And this was really a massive house. And the drawing may give one indication, but if you look at the photo of this from 1893, it really is just quite massive. And that amazing giant portico there where the carriages would be pulling up and dropping you off the portico share. It's extremely formal and impressive. So now that we've talked a little bit about Dietrich and you see some of his work, I want to talk a little bit about E. Starr Sanford, who basically is the person who was the original builder and owner of the Hearthstone. He was born in 1861 here in Danbury. He was the second of 7 children. And what's interesting to note is that his father, Charles, was originally involved in the hat industry, which a lot of people in Danbury were, obviously. But then Danbury was given some money and they formed the first library here. And his father actually was the first librarian. So it's very fitting tonight that we're here in the Danbury Library because it was his father that was the first librarian. And then when he passed away, his mother took over as librarian. And just of note too is I guess the fact that the Sanford family goes very, very far back in history, dating back, I think, to the 1630s here in Boston. So this is again, a census entry from 1880, and you see here that Star Sanford is listed, and he's then a photographer, so he's already practicing his trade at this point. He started his photography at the age of 14. He first was training under a photographer named Folsom, who was working here in Danbury first, and then he basically had a solo practice for 4 years. And then there was a terrible event that happened where there was a fire, and the fire destroyed his studio, and that caused him to go looking for another place to do his photography. But before we get to all of that, he was married to Emma Gray, and that happened in 1882. And they had one son who was named Charles after his father, who was born in 1888. And so basically they were a fairly small family, just the three of them. What happens then is, as I mentioned, there was this terrible studio fire that happened here in Danbury. He had to look for a new place to work, and he ended up teaming up with Davis. And basically, the firm of Davis and Sanford became extremely famous. And they opened a studio on Fifth Avenue in New York, and you can see the building there on the left. And basically, they would occupy 3 floors in that building, and they had about 30 assistants that would be working with them doing the photography. So this was not just a couple of guys, it was a huge practice. And they took portraits at the time of the most famous people. So if you were from Europe and you were coming to the US, you sat with them and had your portraits done. He did Carnegie, as I list here, the Rockefellers, Alexander Cassatt, Roosevelt's, tons and tons of celebrities and who's who. So if you just go back, a lot of times at this time period, you know, their portrait was done by Davis and Sanford. So what's interesting then is that the one other celebrity that Davis and Sanford took a picture of is of Dietrich himself. So this is a family portrait that was done about 1898 of the Dietrich family. And this was before their youngest son, George, was born, but the Dietrichs would go on to have 6 boys themselves. And I just think it's really interesting. The 1898 time period is right when the Hearthstone would have been finished. And so there must have been a little bit of a thank you or a quid pro quo that was going on in exchange. You know, part of the design services is that they get this beautiful portrait back done by the photographer. So I want to just talk now a little bit about the Hearthstone itself. So this is a quote from Dietrich, again from that cobblestone building. So if cobblestones are picked up as they are found and placed in the wall without any trickery, with the sides that have been colored by exposure to the weather, some brown, red, and gray of various shades, others covered with moss, now and then a yellow, and here and there a beautiful silver gray placed in the wall, promiscuous sizes, undisturbed face, with sunlight playing on the irregular face, casting shadows and bringing out highlights, and no two alike, the result will be very satisfactory and anything but monotonous. And so I really think this is what he had in mind when he was thinking about the Hearthstone itself and how you were picking up those natural stones from the hillside and figuring out how you could place them in the building to create sort of the archways over the windows and, you know, the sort of crenellation at the top of the building. It's just amazing when you're actually there in person and you see the size of some of these stones that are used for the sill pieces and the steps and the thresholds. It's really impressive. So the Hearthstone itself, just to orient everybody, and especially the people online that aren't here locally, is basically on the south end of Danbury itself. You can see the main house is the largest element here in the image. And then there are several outbuildings that included a carriage house building, a caretaker's cottage, a workshop, and then a couple of well buildings that were located all on the estate. Originally, there were 19 acres that were purchased at the time to compose basically the Hearthstone when it was first thought out and planned out. And of course, I guess it's important to note just for everybody as well that isn't local, this is all part of Tarrywile Park now here in Danbury. And the Tarrywile Mansion is directly across the street. And that's actually where you go if you're visiting to park before you sort of hike around and make your way to the Hearthstone itself. So basically in 1895, Sanford bought those 19 acres that were at this summit called Mountain End. And by October of that year, it was noted in the newspaper that 2 acres had begun to be cleared to basically plan out where the house and gardens would be located. By spring of 1896, work on the house began. And this is really amazing considering the amount of terracing been stonework that had to be done just to make a place to build the house on this very steep and sloping site. You can see a photo here of the work going on for the foundations of the house. And you might notice there's a small railway kind of carriage that's on the left-hand side that I think was used to move the stones and other heavy pieces around. So that was just an interesting thing to note. So here's a drawing of Dietrich's for the house, looking at it basically from kind of lower down on the hill up at the main tower. And this is how that was described. The house itself is solidly built of stone, contains 18 rooms besides 2 bathrooms and 4 toilet rooms. Also a piazza of 150 feet in length. Besides the hot water heating system, the house has 9 open fireplaces. All floors through are hardwood. In the matter of lighting, there's both electricity and gas, and the fixtures were especially designed for the house. An elevator rises from cellar to the top floor for the purpose of raising trunks. So at the time this was built, although it might have looked rustic on the exterior, it really was fully state-of-the-art for the interior and would not have been an inexpensive proposition. This is a look at the house from the other side, and you can see here the sort of porte cochere that extends out from the wraparound porch. And that really was your entry point when you would be arriving, because to get here up to the steep site and up the very steep driveway, you really would be coming by carriage. And then the thing that met you most dramatically right away was that you would disembark from your carriage at the porte cochere. And as soon as you entered the wraparound porch, you had this stunning view of Danbury that would be out in front of you. And this is how that approach looked if you were coming up the driveway back in 1902. And just to mention again, the rough quality of the castle's fieldstone exterior and the wood shingled walls of the outbuildings reinforce the emphasis on natural textures and a harmonious relationship with the wooded mountaintop site. That comes from the National Register nomination. So that's language that was used when the architectural historians were analyzing the building. So there really was an emphasis, as we've been talking about, between the nature of the site and then the design of the building. And so this is that view that would have met you when the site was all clear. You can see Danbury there in the background. So you would be looking out from this house having this amazing vista. And you can see here the spacious open veranda, basically from which the towns far to the north can be sighted. And they mention it's great for summer parties, which I can imagine as well. So here's a view looking again towards the porte cochere. I believe this is Mrs. Sanford probably, who's standing on the porch there looking out. You can see at the time that even though it was set in this sort of rustic setting, there still would have been manicured pathways and lawns and gardens around the house. So it certainly did have a lot of landscaping as well. And then just to show you some interior shots. So I've got the plan here on the right-hand side, just to orient you to where we are. We're looking right now from the main front door into the entry hall. And one of the unique features of the house is that the center is really composed of this large chimney with 4 fireplaces all angling to each room. And you can see that fireplace in the entry hall here in the photo. It's amazing because while the house is very clearly rustic and castle-like and has some Norman Gothic elements on the exterior, the interior is much more of a mixed expression of different architectural styles. And so there's an interesting detail with the oak on the staircase railing. Rather than having ornamented balusters and things, you sort of have this very clean lines, and you sort of have those metal pegs that are located inside there. Also the massive sort of cased beams that are in the ceiling. The entry hall was all done in beautiful oak finish. And these are some photos from the nomination for the National Register. So this would have been from 1985, 1986. And you can see basically a detail of the carved lion, which was in the fireplace there in the entry hall. Some of the other fireplaces in the house and the main staircase going up in one of the towers with the stained glass. I just want you to pay attention to the fireplace on the left-hand side. That's sort of the tall tile going all the way up, because we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So just remember that one. And then we go and we see the library here. So again, the library now, again, less castle looking, less sort of imposing. This is much more of a warm, typical for the time period interior room. So that would have been really a warm space in the house where the family would have gathered. And then of course, the dining room as well was a very special room. It had doors on the left-hand side where the light is coming from going out to the porch, and of course to the views again. And you can see that there's some built-in cabinetry with china and things towards the window, and then on the left of the window in the back of the room. And this is a view of that same dining room, basically. I think this photo is more from 1960. So you can see still the beams in the ceiling, and the whole overall form is there, even though some of the ornamentation has been taken away by this point. And so going back to Sanford a little bit, I just want to touch a little more on his story. So in 1899, the family had moved into the house basically by 1898. In 1899, unfortunately, their second child was born, but was stillborn. So that was a tragic loss for them. And by 1902, basically the Hearthstone had to be sold. And there's some rumors and things that I've read here in the Danbury press and in some of the things that Mrs. Sanford was very unhappy in the house or didn't like the house. It was also said that it was a honeymoon gift for her, which is not true because they were married many, many years before then, and she would have been very much involved in the planning of the house. So I really think the main reason, looking back at things, is that it was really financial problems. There were liens on the property the whole time the Sanfords own it. They weren't able to pay off some of the contractors. And so I think what happened is that really they just weren't able to sustain the payments and keep this house going that they spent so much money to construct. And basically following that then in 1903, the partnership with Davis in New York ended. So he went on and found another partner, but what had really been the source of the family's income, the successful photography business, was no longer happening. And he ended up then moving to New Haven instead in Connecticut and opened a studio there. I then came across documentation that shortly after that, they sold the building in New Haven and actually took off to Europe for 2 years. So I'm not sure what the reason was there, if they wanted to kind of reconcile after the loss of their second child, but they were gone. And then when he came back, basically settled in Greenwich, worked for a time there. Their son Charles was now grown by that point, and he went on to live in Texas. And a very strange story, in 1914, Sanford was going to Texas, and in those days you went by boat. That's how you got down there. And lightning hit the boat that he was on, and it actually rendered him having eye damage. So in the end, he really had problems with his sight and with his eyes, which is really crazy thinking he was a photographer. So this is, what happened here. But then basically he died at the age of only 55 in 1917, and that really stems from that lightning accident that happened. So the second owners of the house, it was the Victor Buck family, and they ended up changing the name to Buck's Castle. Victor Buck came from Missouri and was an industrialist. He started with shoes and boots and actually worked in property and railroads and all of those things at the time. It was very interesting because he basically moved to Danbury in his retirement. And at this point in time, then he made a statement that no more beautiful spot on earth in all seasons of the year when he was talking about his time at the Hearthstone. And knowing the winters here, I mean, you might object a little bit if you wanted to go to Florida or somewhere else, but apparently he thought this was extremely, extremely healthy. And especially the fact that they had the artisan wells and things on the estate as well. And he thought that water was very healthy. Victor Buck ended up dying at the age of 87 in 1921. So clearly, he was healthy and lived a good long life and was very happy at the Hearthstone for, basically about 20 years. So then Parks Castle is basically the next incarnation that happens. So Charles Darling Parks basically purchased the castle after, after Buck had died. And I came across this interesting article here from the 1920s. It's basically an advertisement for the house, saying that it's for sale, this gentleman's country home. And they're saying that it basically needs to be sold because of settling an estate. So basically that was from Buck's family at that time wanting to sell the house. Now, Charles Darling Parks lived right across the street at Tarrywile, and he had the house that was there, which had a large dairy farm associated with it. Parks had been involved in a lot of businesses, but he's well known for being the president of the American Hatter and Furrier Company in Danbury. And so basically he wanted to be a gentleman farmer and start expanding his estate and gaining more property. And so eventually when the castle was for sale across the street, he bought it and ended up basically giving it to his daughter, Irene. And she was living there amazingly in the house all the way until 1976. So what's really incredible is that this house, for stretching all the way back to the 1890s, only had 3 owners until eventually the city of Danbury bought it. So it's really amazing that Irene and her family had so many years in the house, and I'm sure so many happy memories. So as Irene was getting older, and after 1976, she had to move out of the house. So there was negotiations that started with the city of Danbury, and it was offered basically to be turning the estate into a park property that would basically be really advantageous for the city. And it is extremely close from downtown and from the center here, right where we're at the library, to get to this area. So you can imagine the attractiveness to the city. But it took 12 years and 2 voter referendums to finally get the money and to get it approved for the city to buy the house. So what happened then after the city purchased it in 1985 is that there really was not investment and maintenance carried on to be able to preserve the house. And because of its unique design with a completely flat roof and not having the investment really to protect it, over time, things were happening on the 3rd floor, and then water was leaking to the 2nd floor, and it just sort of went. It was listed on the National Register in 1986. And then in addition, there was a study in the 1990s that was done, the Zerlo study, which really looked at how to repurpose the house into possibly a conference center or to do something. So there have been a couple stops and starts with things, but really the house has just sort of been there and been exposed to the elements. The photos that I'm going to show you now of the existing condition were taken pre-COVID. And just so that everybody knows, and you'll see at the end, the house has had some clearing work and things that have been done on it more recently. So it's really just the stone walls that are remaining. But this is a dramatic view that you see looking up at the house, kind of from the stone terracing at the bottom. And here you see a side view, again, looking at the tower. And this is a view looking, again, we saw this a minute ago when Mrs. Sanford was sort of standing on the porch there. So this is when really the nature has just grown in and really come right up around the house. And it feels almost like it's part architecture and it's also sort of part nature, right? Where this sort of romantic ideal of the stones and all of the things growing around it. And you can see there's one special stone noting the year it was built in 1897. This again is looking at that porte cochere, and it gives you just an opportunity again to look at all of the different types of stonework that were used. And again, these beautiful arches where the stones are just sort of naturally wedged next to each other. And again, just some details of the sort of corbels that are holding up pieces where the porch originally would have been, the tower for the stairs, the detail there, and then the buttress that we see on the right-hand side here that's part of the porte cochere. And this is looking down the porch as it was at that time when the porch was still there, sort of getting a sense of scale and seeing the stonework that was on the sides. And then this is the interior at that time that I was visiting. And you can see where from all of the elements, it really has just sort of collapsed in on itself. And I had mentioned back the sort of tiled fireplace where the tile work went all the way to the ceiling. You can see in the green tiles there on the left, that's that 2nd story that was really right at the top of the staircase where you would have seen that fireplace. And so this is basically our current state. This photo is from March of 2022. And you can see that the city has gone in and basically taken all of the interior debris and things that are around the house away. And they've also cleared away a lot of the vegetation to keep it from overgrowing on the house. I think the hope now is that having that initial work done and having things sort of cleared up and taken away is that the house can be stabilized and the stone walls can be sort of waiting there for whatever happens and whatever the next chapter is going to be for the castle. So we could have ended right there a little bit, but I have one other thing with the castle I want to talk about. This is interesting. I was just recently on a trip to Belhaven in Greenwich, Connecticut. And located there is the Park House, interestingly, not Parks, but the Park House there called Snug Harbor. And this is a colonial revival house that was done in 1892. And this is basically how the house looks today. It's had some modifications done on the exterior. But the interesting thing to note when you look at the two houses and compare them side by side, and especially the floor plans, is that essentially these two are the same house. And what's happened is that they're just mirror images. So you can see sort of on one side, we've got the round tower for the living room. On the other side, the mirror image, the round tower. The stair that's here in the half circle, the same thing with the stair here. The position of the dining rooms is the same. And then I highlighted just on the exterior where those sort of, again, circular elements for the stairs are located. So what I think is really interesting with this is that you can see that Dietrich was so talented that he could take the same floor plan and really do a completely different exterior and expression, whether it was in the colonial revival style in a much more traditional and formal look, or whether you wanted it to be more natural and going into the sort of almost arts and crafts style with all of the stonework that was used on the hearthstone. And so talking about that brings us basically to his work with Stickley. Dietrich is known for being the first architect to design what's quote unquote a craftsman style house. So he worked with Stickley in 1903 and they cooperated on the design of this house, which was published in May of that year in Stickley's Craftsman magazine. You can see here the interiors. These are drawings by Dietrich, but the furniture that's put in place is from Stickley's furniture collection. So it was really a collaboration about creating architecture in a home that could house the Stickley designed furniture. That was really their only collaboration, but Dietrich kept going and working in the arts and crafts style later on. And for those of you that don't know, the arts and crafts style really came from the UK in the beginning. It wasn't just about the architecture, but really a whole lifestyle and ecosystem in terms of that workers would be fairly compensated with good social conditions, that they would be appreciated more as fine artisans than just workmen, that they would be kind of craftsmen. And basically, again, turning away from that Victorian mass production and going into things that talented workers like stonemasons, the Hearthstone, could do and create these amazing things. And it also talks about really the home life that went on and about, you know, the hearth and the fireplace and creating spaces for the home and the family. So these are just a couple quick arts and crafts designs by Dietrich. This is the Red Swan Inn, which was in Warwick in 1902. And this is a photo of that building when it was completed. And nearby here to us in Torrington, we have the Luther Turner House. I did a talk on this a few years ago up in Torrington. It's a beautiful home. You can see again here, it has a lot of the stone elements similar to the hearthstone and the porch and the chimneys. And what's interesting on the interior photos is you can see that the interiors start to embrace really that kind of arts and crafts and craftsman style by this point. So they're much more limited and much more, you know, staid looking rather than the vibrant interiors that we saw before. And then again, we have the Adams Zolt House. This was in Washington, Pennsylvania. This is a beautiful one. It looks in the drawing as if it was a stucco finish. And you can see the entry again, having this very arts and crafts look to it. This is more of a bungalow house. And what's interesting is by kind of 1917 and onward, most of the houses at that time that Dietrich was working on really became more horizontal and low. And you can see his design aesthetic as the period was sort of doing was you know, kind of retreating from these grand three-story houses, and the bungalow and the lower, you know, more horizontal form was in style. And he really did a great job with this one, with the beautiful stonework and this archway that sort of just emphasizes the stairs and the entry going in. This one in Lyme, Connecticut was basically a converted barn that was turned into a house. So you see the barn down below and then the house that was constructed on top of it. And one of my favorites, this is from late in his career in 1919. This was basically done in Monroe County, which is the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania. And again, you can see the beautiful use of the stonework, but again, not as vertical as before. This is much more a lower, you know, lower house, more horizontal, but it still has that sort of porte cochere coming up from it to embrace you as you arrive. And not only, obviously, at this time, it was the exterior, but the interiors he was very much involved in, and they were really, really beautiful. This is one of the renderings that he did for that house, the interior here. And so talking just a little bit more about Dietrich's family in the end, there's one saga that if you ever Google, this is something that will come up, and it's kind of an interesting chapter, a really tragic one. His son Emerson, who he had dreams of becoming an architect and sending him to Cornell to train, decided instead he was going to run away from home and become a lion tamer. So he went off with a vaudeville show and basically was this lion tamer with this woman who did the lion stunts. And they were on their way back coming to New York. They were in Chicago in the railroad yards. And unfortunately, Dietrich was feeding the lion and he was attacked and sort of killed by the lion. Well, there were some reports at the time that it was actually the assistant zookeeper who was jealous because there were rumors that Dietrich and the lion tamer lady were engaged and were actually going back to New York to spread their engagement news. So we don't know what the true story is. The engagement was sort of said never happened. There was an FBI, not an FBI, sorry, but an investigative report that thinks they might have found bullet wounds. The newspapers were all over, and this was really published widely across the whole country. But not to make light of this, because I think at this time period in 1914, this really, was a painful episode for Dietrich. And this was also kind of coinciding with the end of this sort of country house style that he had been working in. The beginning of World War I at that point in Europe, and eventually in 1917, World War I here, was bringing the Gilded Age and these country houses and things. That lifestyle was kind of coming to a close. And so his primary work had always been in those sorts of residential structures. And so I think it was kind of a double impact at this time between the death of his son and then also kind of the changing social circumstances that were starting to impact his business. And so finally, Eliza Estelle Dietrich, she passed away in April of 1924. And then sadly, on Christmas Eve of 1924 as well, Dietrich was actually going into work in Manhattan, waiting for the Long Island Railroad. He lived in Freeport then. And he had a heart attack on the train platform and died there in Freeport. So really soon after his wife, and you can see at Greenwood Cemetery, their tombstone with the one son, Emerson, buried there as well. So I just want to close and sort of finish. This was an obituary that was written in the AIA Journal, and it's just a really touching tribute, I think, because it's not written sort of generically, but it's from his colleagues and two of his fellow architects, and they said, "This brief outline of his career will perhaps mean little to those without knowledge of his personal qualities. He was a man of sterling character, kind, considerate, always a gentleman, ready to render service or give advice to anyone who asked, and to work for a worthy cause. In brief, to know him was to love him, and his passing was a grief to his many friends who held him in their highest esteem." So I think not only was he a talented, architect at the end, but I think he really had a very good character, which is of course certainly important as well. So before we go to questions, I want to just let you know that I've started really to engage on social media and to spread the word about my research on Dietrich, because there is so much of it now. I started a website. You can see here, egwdietrich.org, where you can find out about more information and events. Also under EGW Dietrich on Facebook and Instagram. And then finally, I just have to say a little bit of a thank you tonight. Council member here in Danbury, Paul Rotello, was very helpful. Over the years, he put me in touch here with the Danbury Library, but also just in encouraging me to come here and to give a talk. Also, thank you, Catherine, and the Danbury Library for hosting us tonight. I'd like to thank a special guest we have in the audience. We have Janet Olszewski here. She's actually Dietrich's great-granddaughter, and she came from New Jersey to join us. So thank you so much, Janet, for being here tonight. It's very special. And then finally, Matt Bernard, who's an author and researcher in Greenwich, Connecticut. He showed me around and helped me with some of the houses and the research there for this presentation. So thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be able to kind of share my knowledge with the community here.
I've only been to Gillette Castle once, but it reminds me a little bit of that. Is there any connection time-wise, or is one older than the other?
Yeah, so I don't know if the people online can hear, but the question is about Gillette Castle, which is also here in Connecticut. It's a little further east. Gillette Castle was built, I think 15 years or so later. It was really more about, in the 19-teens that castle was built. So it's a later time period. And I think from at least my analysis looking at it, I think that it's a little bit more of what I would call almost a folly. There's less of a structured design to the castle. It's a little bit more very romantic and very kind of randomized and eccentric in a way. Whereas I think the Hearthstone in some ways has a little bit more integrity to its design. Obviously it was earlier. And I think the key thing here was so much about the local connection to the stone and about how the stones came right from the site and it was put right on that hillside. And so that's kind of, I guess, my analysis of the two. I mean, obviously, Gillette Castle now is a beautiful landmark. It's historic. I mean, people go and visit it. It's a big tourist attraction. So there's a little difference, I guess, in the two stories of how the castles, came to be handled in their later years. Sure, sure. So the question was if the Hearthstone Castle is Dietrich's most well-known design or work of architecture. I would say certainly it's one of the most well-known and certainly the most unique. I think his work with Stickley, if you're an architectural person or an architectural scholar or an architectural historian, you'll probably know his collaboration with Stickley because Stickley has been so widely publicized and is well known. But I think certainly in terms of being a unique structure, and there's so much interest in the Hearthstone, people go there hiking and photographing it and just showing it because it's such a unique ruin that definitely brings interest to Dietrich as well.
Chris, I have a question.
So the question, are any of the houses for sale? Well, I probably bet you could work with the city of Danbury to restore this and maybe get a 99-year lease on it. But there have been houses that have come for sale over time. Recently, there was a house for sale in Cranford, New Jersey, and there was also one in Tarrytown. The Cranford house was very colonial revival in style. The one in Tarrytown is more shingle style. Beautiful views looking out over the river and the bridge and everything there. So they certainly do come for sale. And I guess keep asking me because I keep looking. I follow them all the time and want to track one down. So
We're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and our house will be for sale next year.
Sure. Or can I open it up here?
Yeah.
All right, cool. I've got it open. So the first question, this is from Sarah. She's asking, is there an estimate on how much it would cost to restore the castle? I don't know that. I don't know that the city has done an estimate to get a full understanding. In some ways, the interiors, so much, I mean, it's all gone, right? So I don't think that there's any way without the craftsmen that we have. I mean, there's just no way to recreate those interiors. I think the latest interest really is in stabilizing the structure. And then I think it's in finding out like what uses could be. I've heard talked about like a glass roof over the top and turning it into some kind of an atrium greenhouse. I still think, from my design perspective, you could go in and sort of do a very clean, modern something on the interior in sort of a conference center or an exhibition space. A place to put the Dietrich drawings. So there are, I think, a lot of options that could come about for the interior, but I don't know the price, and I don't know that that's clearly known. Again, I guess I just sort of answered this. What does the city of Danbury plan to do with the castle? So that's really what we just talked about. Oh, somebody's saying their house in Pittsburgh will be for sale this year. Okay, great. So there we go. That's the one in Ben Avon. So that's a beautiful house. I visited the outside. So just so everybody knows, if you're interested, you'd have to move to Pittsburgh. But do you have any information on the churches that Dietrich designed and built? So Dietrich did work on a large number of churches. I have one of them here on display in person, which is the church that was in Warwick, the one that I talked about in the presentation. Beyond that, there's a whole collection of his churches, and I've been researching them, and I know sort of what ones were built and what are available, but for me at least, it's harder to categorize them in a way because the churches are much more traditional. It looks like a church. It's a Gothic style church, or it has a Romanesque style arch in a church. They're not as cutting edge in terms of representing some of the shingle style elements and things the way that the Warwick is probably the one that does that the best. I do know that there's a church that was built in Freeport on Long Island where he lived at the end of his life that they actually attended the congregation, but the church was not finished until after his death. But that's a very special one because he designed it and that was sort of his home congregation there. Oh, Louis Zerlo just died last year, somebody's saying. That's interesting. So there's a question, this is the last one about his office records or just the project files. So I have not found any information about his direct office records. I have started to research and track down some of the people that were draftsmen and became other independent architects that worked in his office. The best record that I really have is all of his works that were published that were really in the architectural periodicals. And then the drawings that you're seeing here tonight are really from his archive of drawings. And that's something that I recently acquired as well. So there's a huge number of his original drawings. Those are primarily presentation drawings and renderings more than working drawings. So they give a really good idea of what the concepts for the houses were. I have been in touch over the years with several very generous and friendly homeowners, and they've had the blueprints left. Not always blueprints. Sometimes they're drawn in different colors, but some later period they were blueprints. But they have the actual working drawings for the houses. So it seems like the trend then at least was the working drawings because they were on site and they were being used by the construction workers. They ended up staying there. So I think that's let's see, was the lumber from the interior all scrapped? I think it was. I think at the time that this is for the Hearthstone now. By the time that the Hearthstone really was being cleaned up, at that point, it had been out in the elements, it had been rotting, it had collapsed. So I think most of the woodwork and things inside the house, it happened so gradually over time that there wasn't a moment when people said, let's go in and save it. It just sort of evolved over many years. Are there any other questions from here? Okay, go ahead.
One of the slides showed the house for sale, and it said $50,000. Do you know how much it cost to build?
I don't know. I haven't come across a statistic. Sometimes they did publish the time, the housing cost. I don't know what the initial investment was in terms of to build at the beginning. I think it also might have said, or at least in one of the articles, it was being offered at half price because they needed to get rid of it. And I think that might have been actually when Sanford was selling it. So at the time that they were trying to get rid of it, they were taking really a big loss on it just to sort of be rid of the house and not have to pay for it anymore. Because you can imagine not only the initial cost and what you paid, but just the upkeep on something like that over time would be enormous.
I was just curious about your background. Are you an architect, historian?
Oh, sure. So the question is just about my background. So I work for a firm called Paycobb Freedom Partners. If you know I Am Pay, who designed the Louvre and several other prominent projects. So that's the firm that I work for. I've been there since 2003. So my work, separate from this, is not really historical. It's very modern, commercial designs, high-rise buildings, modern, very green curtain wall design. So this is just a totally separate hobby. And it's kind of, in a sense, what can keep you sane from the technical details and working on that in the regular architectural world is having this kind of on the side to be, a sort of different side of the same coin, I guess, right? Oh, sorry.
I saw on that 1922 article, it was $1,000.
Wow. So the comment was just that it's the 1922 price of $50,000 would have been $870,000 now, which is, I think, a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. So that's a very good deal. All right, great. Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to have had the opportunity to talk to you here in person, and also everybody who's kindly taken time to join us on Zoom. Thank you. And again, if there's any other questions, I'll be standing by the drawings for a little bit and we can, take a look, or if you have questions about those, I'd be happy to give an explanation. Okay, thank you.